Welcome to Lawgical, the UAE's first legal podcast. My name is Tim Elliott. Lawgical comes to you from the Dubai-based legal firm Ludmila Yamalova and Pleska. And here's the managing partner, Ludmila Yamalova. Good to see you.
Good to be here with you, Tim, as always.
So this time today, just a quick look at the job seekers visa. This is a new announcement, Ludmila, and it's in accordance with UAE Cabinet Resolution 65 of 2022. And really in simple terms, this is if you're looking for work, you're kind of welcome to come and look, essentially.
That's exactly right. And this is the resolution you mentioned, which is the resolution number 65/2022, is otherwise known as the UAE, the new UAE immigration law. Right. And this is quite a large legislative source of information that ultimately introduced some fairly significant reforms into the UAE residency or immigration framework. And as one of these announcements or one of the new changes is this job seekers visa, which is a very specialized visa that allows those who want to visit the UAE to basically explore opportunities, employment opportunities, to apply for a very specialized visa to exactly do that. So this is truly one of its kind and the first one ever visa of this kind that this country has offered. This is somewhat groundbreaking, and in many ways, having lived here for so many years, I personally feel that this was such a tremendous positive step forward because, let's face it, the UAE over the years has become ever more appealing and attractive for people to come and want to live here and work here. And but at the same time, it's not perhaps as easy to find a job here as it was before. And many people do want to come and explore and see what opportunities there are here. And over the years, I've seen over and over again, people do that. They'll come on a tourist visa and they will stay here on a tourist visa while trying to look for a job. So, and those visas usually are shorter in time, or at least historically, and then sometimes people even start trying out and working a little bit. And so all that previously was actually illegal to do, technically speaking. It was done all too often, but it was somewhat illegal to do because when you get, in the past you get a tourist visa, you get a tourist visa. That means you come here on tourism. So when you start looking for a job, in technical terms, there was inconsistency between the type of visa that you come here and the actual activities that you were pursuing here while in the country. So now this particular visa, and then it's Article 20 and 21 to be precise, now offers a very specialized visa, and it is called a job seekers visa. More importantly, this particular visa does not require a sponsor or a guarantor, and which was the case before. So often in the past, when you wanted to come visit the UAE on a visa, you needed somebody here on the ground to be your guarantor or your sponsor. And they would have to present all sorts of documents, and ultimately they would be responsible for you. Now, under this new immigration law and this particular visa, you don't need to have a sponsor here. It doesn't need to be an individual or, for example, a company who you're trying to see and explore whether you could actually work for them or not. So it's in other words, it's a self-sponsored visa. And it's available, but it is available to not to everyone, so to speak. So there are some limitations or eligibility requirements for whom this kind of visa is in fact available or offered. And at a high level, so those who would qualify must meet certain conditions, one of which is the applicant, for example, must be an experienced worker, either an experienced worker, and what's called at the first, second, and third professional level, as the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization classifies.
Okay, well, what does that mean precisely?
So it's actually a fairly complicated and multifaceted exercise, if you will. So this would require to go onto the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization website, and they have a tab there for the classification system, and it's pages and pages and pages basically that set out this is your first category of employees or professions, this is the second category of professions, and within each one of these categories a whole long list of different types of professions that fall into each one of these categories. But ultimately it's more professionals, if you will. For example, engineers, doctors, tech professionals, teachers, and so on and so forth. So But the categories differ on the basis of what industry or what specific sort of professional qualification it is. But at a high level, and again, there's many details, many different professions that are listed in there. So if you wanted to know whether you qualify, you literally need to go and download one of these classification documents and go one by one to see if you fit and under which one of the specific categories you would fit. But it's pretty expansive and pretty inclusive categories. So it's not like that it just only applies to a doctor, for example. There's under each one of these levels of categories, there are dozens of dozens of specific professions. So that's basically that's one eligibility requirement. The other one, if you are not one of those experienced workers, then you have to be a recent graduate. So in other words, you can also qualify for this job seekers visa if you're a recent graduate, but you must not be more than 2 years out from your graduation date. So in other words, a really recent graduate, and you have to be a recent graduate from one of the world's top 500 universities. So top 500 best universities in the world, as is classified again, but not this time. It's by the UAE Ministry of Education. So if the first classification we're talking about in terms of experienced workers, those classifications are listed by the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization, or otherwise referred to as MOHRE. And now this particular classification, because now we're talking about recent graduate students, that is, so the classification here is set by the Ministry of Education, the UAE Ministry of Education. And once again, you would have to access the website and then see there's a whole list of, under the UAE Ministry of Education, of the 500 best universities that this country deems to be best universities, and from which universities these graduates would qualify to apply for job seekers visa. But all in all, whether you are an experienced worker or a graduate, the minimum educational requirement has to be a bachelor's degree or the equivalent, whatever that may mean. And so basically that's in terms of the qualifications, if you will. And then as part of the visa application, you also need to provide what's called security or financial security. The law itself, interestingly enough, does not, it just basically states a requirement for financial security, but does not state what that amount is. But since then, there have been regulations that have been passed to further highlight certain aspects of the law. And as per this regulation, with regard to this financial security for this particular visa, it's a payment of 1,000 to 2,000 dirhams. So it's not at all a significant financial commitment that you need to prove, which was the big question for a while until the regulations came forward. You know, how much? Because if you're coming here to look for a job, theoretically you probably don't have a lot of money to show for, and you don't really want to spend a lot of money to try to look for a job. So this particular amount of financial security, I think, is quite reasonable, and certainly makes this particular visa a lot more palatable.
All right, so let's assume that you fulfill all those requirements, you've been to the right university, you are at the right level, as it were, to come into the country, you fulfill the prescribed financial security. How long does the visa last, or the job seekers visa? And if you then find employment, how easy is it to switch to a permanent residence working with?
So the duration of this particular job seekers visa actually is granted first for 60 days. So this too in of itself is quite significant departure from the previous practice, because previously the default was 30 days, or depending on nationality, and you could have extended one more time, but that was basically it. Now this time the default is 60 days. Okay. And it can actually be renewed several times, up to 180 days, depending on the circumstances. Okay. So what that means is that theoretically this kind of visa allows you to be in the country for up to 6 months looking for a job. And obviously this in a way benefits both the applicant and the country, because it means that the person would have enough time to look for the right job, and that means that once he or she finally secures employment, at least in theory, that employment opportunity will be more stable than what would happen in the past, because the time is running so fast. You just take the first opportunity you could, just to allow yourself to stay in the country. So, in theory, at least with this kind of option, you can really take your time and make sure that whenever you commit yourself, and equally so for the company, whenever they decide to hire you, that this is sort of more or less the right fit for you, and therefore would at least, again, theoretically, introduce some sort of level of consistency and security for both parties.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? We've talked about this before at some length. You know, you have time to do your due diligence. And I guess by the same token, whoever's going to employ you, they have time to do the same. So it's a good thing for a steady job market, isn't it?
For sure. I would offer that this is exactly the reason why these sweeping reforms in immigration policies took place, and why these specific types of visas were introduced exactly for that, because there's so many other consequences or repercussions that would follow in the past, all stemming from the fact that parties would commit themselves to a job that they ultimately wasn't really right for one or the other party. So, for example, if you recall, there were all sorts of bans before. And that was travel bans, employment bans that would be applied to employees if they were to resign, let's say within first 6 months or within 1 year of their employment, it depends. And it was all because what was happening often is that somebody would come to the country and on this 30-day tourist visa, find a job, get a job just so that they didn't have to go back, knowing full well that they weren't going to really stay with that job for a long time. And then the next opportunity would present itself. 2 or 3 weeks later, they would jump. And this is why there are all sorts of employment regulations, for example, that existed that actually penalize these kinds of behaviors, because that was very unstable and unsettling for the business market, as you may appreciate. So in effect, you needed to have this whole legal ecosystem, if you will, to try to deal with the repercussions of these kind of jumpers that would come and jump on the first job that they could, just so that they can find another job that was better. But simply because they didn't have enough time, they didn't have the luxury to actually really take their time and make the first choice proper one.
Because it was always kind of amplified here, wasn't it? That situation, people would come in, take that first job within 30 days, and then you have this kind of a rebound effect almost. And that's just, there's no time to build any trust, is there?
And this is exactly why we saw the practices, the employment practices, the employment laws, the immigration practices that developed as a result of this.
Yeah.
And what would often happen, and these are specific examples from my own practice here, is that what happened is somebody would jump on a job just because it gave him a job and gave residency. Then 2-3 months later, they would want to jump to a better job, the actual job that they would have preferred to begin with, but it wasn't available at that time. But because there was an employment ban, because they resigned within, let's say, 6 months from the time they started their job, there were different bans that applied, but for example. So what they would do, they would resign, and they would go, and they knew that they had an employment ban. This was not an immigration ban, it was an employment ban. And they would go and work for that other new company, but while having an employment ban. And it was all good until it wasn't. In other words, until you were not caught. And I had, in my practice here, I had a few of these examples where people were caught, and let's say even it's the previous company that was upset with that employee jumping, and they found out that, well, he or she went and worked for the next company, and while still having an employment ban. And so that person, this particular client of mine, was the immigration inspectors came, inspected the premises, and then fined the company 50,000 dirhams, and also fined this particular individual and deported him. So this is, as you said, was an amplified effect. It was truly the circumstances and the consequences were quite severe, and it was all because of basically this different part of the ecosystem, these different tools existed to ultimately deter these kinds of practices. So it was all too real. And by the way, at the time in particular, when you were working for another company while having an employment ban, that particular practice would lead to deportation. So let's say if you were working in the same case, and by the way, this is again from my personal experience, and almost it's actually from the same client. There was another employee at the same time that was working for that second company, but on a different visa, but was not under the employment ban. In that case, there was just a penalty. It was several thousand dirham penalty, but there was no deportation for this other client, even though it was an English national, and he was deported. And once you're deported from the UAE, you're deported for life. So that's just an example. So now, presumably, this new type of visa will make that practice and all those stories and eventualities a thing of the past. And now people can actually come here and be very transparent about why they're coming into the UAE and not have to hide in somebody's shadow and actually be very open even with all the companies that they're applying to, that we're here in the UAE on a job seeker visa looking for a job. So I think all in all it's a great development for the country and all those prospective recruits that are wanting to come into this country and contribute to the job market.
That's another episode of Lawgical. This time, everything you need to know about the job seeker's visa here in the UAE, or most at least of what you need to know. Our legal expert, as always, Ludmila Yamalova, managing partner here at Yamalova and Plethora, and thank you.
Thank you, Tim, as always.
LYLAW, you can find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, a huge ever-growing library, hundreds of podcasts, all kinds of legal matters here in the UAE are covered. They're all free to listen to. And if you'd like a legal question answered in a future Lawgical episode, or you'd like to talk to a qualified UAE experienced legal professional, click contact at lylawyers.com.